They say I slipped on the wet bathroom tiles. That's the story my parents tell, at least their accident-prone daughter Sophie Jane always finding new ways to hurt herself. But x-rays don't lie, and mine told a different story entirely. 15 years of accidents cataloged across my bones like a hidden map of pain. But before I tell you how one moment changed everything, tell me, where are you experiencing this story from today? Whether you're listening during your morning commute, taking a break at work, or winding down for the evening, I'm grateful you're here. If stories like mine resonate with you, please like and subscribe. I'm Sophie Jane, and every day I share real experiences that matter, voices that need to be heard. My brother Marcus's latest prank that Tuesday morning wasn't supposed to send me to the hospital. It was just supposed to be another joke that everyone would laugh off, another moment where I'd pick myself up, brush off the pain, and pretend everything was normal. Except this time, there were witnesses. This time, the school nurse called 911. This time, I couldn't stand up and smile through the agony. Funny how one shove can bring down an entire family's carefully constructed lies. The Riverside Academy campus sprawled across manicured grounds in our affluent Denver suburb, all red brick buildings and pristine lawns that screamed success and privilege. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. The perfect private school for perfect families. Inside the girls' bathroom near the science wing, I pressed myself against the cold tile wall, hoping to become invisible, until the hallway cleared. At 16, I'd mastered the art of disappearing. The morning rush was always the worst. Too many people, too much noise, too many chances for Marcus to spot me and decide I needed another lesson in humility. "Sophie!" My best friend Chloe's voice echoed off the bathroom walls as she burst through the door. "There you are, Mrs. Peterson is looking for you about the chemistry lab report." I nodded, gathering my books against my chest like armor. I'd learned over the years that the best way to survive at Riverside was to stay focused on academics, keep my head down, and avoid my older brother at all costs. At 17, Marcus was the golden boy, quarterback of the football team, honor roll student, charming smile that made teachers and parents melt. "You okay?" Chloe asked, studying my face with the kind of concern that made my chest tight. "You look like you didn't sleep again." "Just tired," I said automatically. The truth, that I'd spent most of the night with an ice pack on my ribs, where Marcus had accidentally elbowed me during dinner, wasn't something I could share. Who would believe that the Marcus Martinez, pride of Riverside Academy, deliberately hurt his little sister? We walked toward the chemistry lab together, and I almost thought I'd make it through the morning unnoticed. Almost. Well, look who's finally crawling out of her hiding spots. Marcus's voice cut through the hallway chatter like a blade. He was surrounded by his usual crowd, football players and popular girls who hung on his every word. I kept walking, eyes fixed on the floor tiles. "Sophie," he called louder, making sure everyone could hear. "Don't ignore your big brother, that's rude." A few kids laughed. I could feel my face burning as I tried to quicken my pace, but Marcus was faster. He caught up to us near the water fountains, his hand landing on my shoulder with just enough force to make me stumble. "Careful there, sis," he said with that charming smile that fooled everyone but me. "You know how clumsy you can be. Leave her alone, Marcus," Chloe said quietly, but there was steel in her voice. "Just looking out for my little sister," he replied innocently. "Right, Sophie? Tell Chloe how I'm always looking out for you." The words stuck in my throat. "Tell her how you locked me in the basement storage room last weekend until I nearly passed out? Tell her how you held my head underwater in the pool until I thought I was going to die, then convinced Mom and Dad I was showing off and got in over my head?" "She's fine," I whispered instead. Marcus's grip on my shoulder tightened, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to send shooting pain down my arm. "See, Sophie knows I only want what's best for her." The bell rang, saving me from having to respond. Marcus released me with a final squeeze that would leave finger-shaped bruises, and sauntered off with his entourage. I rubbed my shoulder, trying to work out the ache. "I hate him," Chloe muttered under her breath. "He's just being a big brother," I said automatically, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Chemistry class was my sanctuary. Mrs. Peterson was strict but fair, and the precise nature of lab work gave my anxious mind something to focus on. For 50 minutes, I could lose myself in molecular structures and chemical equations, problems with clear solutions and predictable outcomes. I was cleaning my lab station when it happened. Sophie Martinez, please report to the main office. The intercom announcement made my blood run cold. Nothing good ever came from being called to the office. I packed my things with shaking hands, my mind racing through possibilities. Had my grades slipped? Had someone reported the bruises on my arms that I thought I'd hidden so well? The walk to the main office felt like a death march. Students in the hallways seemed to watch me with curious eyes, whispering behind their hands. By the time I reached the office, my heart was pounding so hard, I was sure everyone could hear it. Sophie? Principal Harrison smiled at me, but something was off. Your parents are here to see you. That's when I saw them. Mom and Dad sitting in the visitor chairs, their faces wearing expressions I'd seen 1,000 times before. The look that said I'd done something wrong, something that reflected poorly on the Martinez family name. What's going on? I asked, though part of me already knew. Your brother called us, Dad said, his voice cold with disappointment. He's concerned about some things you've been saying to your friends, stories you've been telling. My stomach dropped. What stories? Don't play innocent, Sophie. Mom's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Marcus told us you've been making up lies about him, telling people he hurts you. I never. Chloe's mother called. Dad interrupted. Apparently, you've been filling her daughter's head with ridiculous accusations. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for our family? The office felt like it was shrinking around me. I looked desperately at Principal Harrison, hoping for some kind of support, but his expression was neutral, professional. This was a family matter, his face seemed to say, not something for the school to get involved in. We're taking you home, Mom announced, standing up and smoothing her designer skirt. We need to have a serious conversation about truth and consequences. I have classes. You should have thought about that before you decided to spread lies about your brother, Dad snapped. The ride home was silent, except for the tension that filled the car like poison gas. I stared out the window at the familiar streets of our upscale neighborhood, houses with perfect lawns hiding perfect families with perfect secrets. Our house sat on a corner lot, all clean lines and expensive landscaping that screamed success to anyone who drove by. Inside, it was a museum of achievement, Marcus's trophies and awards covering every available surface, his photos from football games and school events lining the walls. There were few pictures of me, and the ones that existed showed a girl with carefully concealed bruises and a smile that never reached her eyes. In the living room, Marcus was waiting. He'd left school early too, apparently, and now sat on the leather couch like a prince holding court. His face was a mask of hurt and concern that I knew was just another performance. Sophie, he said sadly, why would you tell people I hurt you? You know I love you. I didn't. Chloe's mom said you showed up to their house with bruises, Mom interrupted, claiming Marcus gave them to you. Because he did, I said quietly. The explosion was immediate. How dare you? Dad's voice boomed through the room. Your brother works hard to maintain his reputation, his future, and you want to destroy it with lies? They're not lies! Show me proof, Marcus said calmly, that awful smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Show them one shred of evidence that I've ever deliberately hurt you. And that was the trap, wasn't it? The bruises faded, the cuts healed, the emotional scars were invisible to everyone but me. How do you prove that your golden boy brother is a monster when he's careful never to leave permanent marks? When your parents have invested so much in believing he's perfect? That's what I thought, Marcus continued when I couldn't respond. Sophie, I think you need help. Professional help. She needs discipline, Dad said firmly. She needs to understand that actions have consequences. That's when I made the mistake that changed everything. I tried to run. I bolted for the stairs, thinking I could lock myself in my room until this nightmare passed. But Marcus was faster, stronger, and he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. His hands connected with my back just as I reached the top step, and I felt myself flying through the air with a force that took my breath away. The world spun around me, ceiling, walls, stairs, and then I was falling, my body hitting each step with sickening thuds that seemed to echo forever. I heard the crack before I felt it. A sound like a branch snapping in a storm. Then I was at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at 3 faces that looked more annoyed than concerned. "Get up, Sophie," Dad said with exasperation. "Stop being so dramatic." But when I tried to move my legs, nothing happened. And for the first time in my life, I realized that some falls you don't get back up from. The paramedics arrived exactly 14 minutes after Chloe's mom called 911. I know because I spent those 14 minutes staring at the grandfather clock in our foyer, watching the second hand tick by while my parents stood over me, their voices a blur of angry whispers about reputation and family image. "She's faking," Dad kept saying to Mom. "You know how dramatic she gets when she wants attention?" "The Hendersons will hear about this," Mom hissed back, referring to our next-door neighbors. "Do you know what this will do to our standing in the neighborhood association?" Marcus had disappeared upstairs the moment we heard the sirens, leaving me alone on the marble floor with parents who were more concerned about gossip than the fact that their daughter couldn't feel her legs. When the EMTs knocked on our front door, Dad answered with his practiced smile, the one he used for clients in PTA meetings. "I'm so sorry you were called out here," he said smoothly. "There's been a misunderstanding. My daughter had a small tumble down the stairs, but she's perfectly fine." "Sir, we need to assess the patient," the female paramedic said firmly. She had kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her name tag read, Maria Santos. "Can you show us where she is?" They found me still lying at the bottom of the stairs, exactly where I'd landed. Maria knelt beside me while her partner, a younger man named David, began unpacking equipment. "Hi there, sweetheart. I'm Maria. What's your name?" "Sophie," I whispered. "Hi, Sophie. Can you tell me what happened?" Before I could answer, Dad jumped in. "She fell down the stairs. Sophie's always been clumsy. Ask anyone. She's constantly having little accidents." Maria's eyes never left my face. "Sophie, I need you to tell me what happened, in your own words." "My brother pushed me," I said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mom made a sharp sound of protest, but Maria held up a hand to silence her. "Can you feel this, Sophie?" David was testing my legs with something that looked like a small hammer. I watched him touch my feet, my calves, my thighs, but felt nothing. "No," I whispered, panic creeping into my voice. "I can't feel anything." Maria and David exchanged a look that made my stomach clench. "We need to transport her immediately," Maria said, standing up. "This could be a serious spinal injury." "That's completely unnecessary," Mom protested. "She's just being dramatic." "Sophie, stop this nonsense right now and get up." "Ma'am," David said, his voice professional but firm, "your daughter is showing signs of potential paralysis. She needs immediate medical attention." "She's not paralyzed," Dad snapped. "She's manipulative. This is what she does when she doesn't get her way." As they prepared to move me onto a stretcher, Maria lifted my shirt slightly to check for other injuries. She went very still, and I knew she'd seen them. The finger-shaped bruises on my ribs from last week, the yellowing marks on my back from the month before. "David," she said quietly, "we need to document this." David moved around to look, and his expression hardened. "Are there other injuries we should know about, Sophie?" I started, but Mom's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Those are from gym class," she said quickly. "Sophie plays volleyball. She's always covered in bruises from sports." I didn't play volleyball. I'd never played volleyball. But Maria was already taking pictures with her phone, and something in her expression told me she knew Mom was lying. "We'll need one parent to accompany us to the hospital," Maria said as they loaded me onto the stretcher. "Hospital policy." "I'll come," Mom said immediately, grabbing her designer purse. "Actually," Maria said carefully, "we'll need to speak with both parents about Sophie's injury history." The ride to Denver General was a blur of sirens and medical jargon I didn't understand. Mom sat beside me in the ambulance, her face a mask of controlled fury. Every few minutes, she'd lean over and whisper things like, "You're embarrassing our family," and "Wait until your father hears what you've done." But I wasn't listening anymore. I was focused on Maria, who kept checking my vital signs and speaking into her radio with words like "possible abuse situation" and, quote, "requesting social services." The emergency room at Denver General was chaos. Nurses rushing around, machines beeping, the smell of antiseptic and fear. They wheeled me into a trauma bay where a doctor with tired eyes and steady hands began examining me. "I'm Dr. Patricia Williams," she said, pulling up a chair beside my gurney. "Sophie, I need to ask you some questions about what happened today." She fell down the stairs. Mom said before I could speak, "She's always been accident-prone. Ever since she was little, she's been falling and bumping into things." Dr. Williams didn't look at Mom. Her attention was entirely focused on me. "Sophie, can you tell me how you fell?" "My brother pushed me," I said, my voice stronger now that I was away from Dad's intimidating presence. "She's confused," Mom interjected. "The trauma, you know. Sometimes it makes people remember things wrong." "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Williams said calmly, "I'm going to need you to step outside while I examine your daughter." "Absolutely not. She's a minor, and I have every right." Actually, in cases of suspected abuse, Colorado law allows us to interview the minor without parental presence, Dr. Williams said. "Security will escort you to the waiting room." The moment Mom was gone, I felt like I could breathe again. Dr. Williams pulled her chair closer and spoke in a voice so gentle it made me want to cry. "Sophie, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of things. The injuries I'm seeing on your body, they're not consistent with a single fall down the stairs. Can you tell me about the other bruises?" And suddenly, it was all pouring out of me. Years of accidents that weren't accidents. The time Marcus locked me in the garage during a thunderstorm because I wouldn't do his homework. The time he held my head underwater in our pool until I nearly drowned, then convinced our parents I'd been showing off. The time he pushed me off my bike, and I ended up with a concussion, but everyone believed his story that I'd hit a pothole. Dr. Williams listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on her tablet. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Sophie, what you're describing is abuse. Physical abuse that's been going on for years, and the fact that your parents have consistently dismissed and ignored these incidents makes them complicit." "But they don't believe me," I said. "They think Marcus is perfect. He's the golden boy, good grades, popular, football scholarship to state. I'm just the problem child." "You're not a problem child, you're a victim." Dr. Williams stood up. "I'm going to order a full body scan, CT, and MRI. We need to see the extent of your current injuries and document any old ones." "What does that mean?" "It means we're going to find the truth, Sophie. Bones don't lie. They keep a record of every injury, every break, every trauma. If your brother has been hurting you for years, your skeleton will show us." 2 hours later, I was lying in the MRI machine, listening to the loud banging and clicking sounds while techs took pictures of my bones. Through the intercom, I could hear medical staff talking in hushed tones about what they were seeing. When it was over, Dr. Williams returned with a tablet full of images that looked like ghostly white pictures of my skeleton. She sat beside my bed and began pointing to different areas. "This is your current injury," she said, showing me my lower back. "A compression fracture of your L2 vertebra. It's serious, but treatable. Your spinal cord isn't severed, which means with proper treatment and physical therapy, you should regain full mobility." Relief flooded through me, but Dr. Williams wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "the scan also shows this." She swiped to another image. "This is a healed fracture in your ribs from approximately 3 months ago. And this," another swipe, "is damage to your shoulder that's about 6 months old. And this wrist fracture that healed improperly. I'd guess that's from about a year ago." I stared at the images. Evidence. Finally, undeniable evidence that I wasn't crazy, wasn't dramatic, wasn't making things up. "There are 11 separate injuries in various stages of healing," Dr. Williams said quietly. "Sophie, this is systematic abuse. This is a pattern of violence that's been happening for years. "What happens now?" I whispered. "Now I call the police. And Child Protective Services. Because no child should have to live in fear in their own home." Through the hospital room door, I could hear my parents in the hallway. Mom was crying loudly about how I was destroying the family, while Dad's voice boomed about lawsuits and false accusations. But for the first time in my life, adults were listening to me. Adults who knew the difference between accidents and abuse. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Whatever you're telling them, stop. You're going to ruin everything. I'm sorry it went too far, but you know you provoked me." I showed the message to Dr. Williams, who immediately took a screenshot. "That's evidence," she said simply. "An admission of guilt." As night fell outside my hospital window, I lay in the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the hospital around me, machines beeping, nurses chatting quietly in the hallway, the distant sound of my parents arguing with hospital administrators about visiting restrictions. For the first time in years, I felt safe. My legs were still numb, my back ached, and my family was falling apart in the waiting room. But I was safe, and the truth was finally coming to light. Dr. Williams returned one more time before her shift ended. "Sophie, I want you to know that you're very brave. It takes incredible courage to speak up about abuse, especially when it's coming from your own family." "I didn't have a choice," I said. "He could have killed me this time." "You always have a choice. And you chose to tell the truth, even when it was hard. That matters." As she left, I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what life might look like on the other side of this nightmare. I couldn't picture it yet. A life without fear, without constantly looking over my shoulder, without making excuses for bruises and broken bones. But for the first time in 16 years, it felt possible. The MRI had shown my injuries, but more than that, it had shown the truth. And tomorrow, when the police arrived to take my statement, I was going to tell them everything. No more secrets, no more lies, no more protecting the person who had spent years destroying me piece by piece. It was time for the Martinez family's perfect facade to crumble. Detective Lisa Chen arrived at Denver General at 8 a.m. sharp, her badge clipped to a navy blazer that had seen better days. She couldn't have been much older than 30, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Behind her walked a woman in her 40s with kind but tired eyes, Sarah Kim from Child Protective Services. "Good morning, Sophie," Detective Chen said, pulling a chair up beside my hospital bed. "I know this is difficult, but we need to hear your story. All of it." I'd spent most of the night rehearsing what I'd say, but now that the moment was here, my throat felt dry. "Where do I start?" "Wherever you feel comfortable," Sarah said gently. "Take your time." So I started at the beginning. The first time Marcus had hurt me, really hurt me. Not just typical sibling roughhousing. I was 8, he was 9, and I'd accidentally broken his favorite toy robot. He'd pushed me down the basement stairs, and I'd broken my wrist. When Mom and Dad found me crying at the bottom of the steps, Marcus told them I'd been playing where I wasn't supposed to and fell. "Did you tell your parents what really happened?" Detective Chen asked. I tried, but Marcus was already their favorite, and I was just the clumsy little sister. They took me to the doctor, got my wrist set, and that was it. Marcus got a lecture about leaving his toys where people could trip over them. Detective Chen made notes while I talked. I told them about the pattern that had developed over the years. Marcus would hurt me, I'd try to tell our parents, and they'd dismiss it as accidents or sibling rivalry, or me being overly dramatic. "The pool incident," I continued, my voice getting steadier. "Last summer, Marcus held my head underwater until I thought I was going to die. When I finally broke free and was coughing up water, gasping for air, he told everyone I'd been showing off, trying to see how long I could hold my breath." "Were there witnesses?" Sarah asked. "Our cousin Jake was there. He looked scared, like he knew something was wrong. But when Mom and Dad asked what happened, he just nodded, along with Marcus's story. Marcus is older, popular, charismatic. People believe him." "What about friends? Teachers? Did you ever try to tell anyone at school?" I shook my head. Riverside Academy isn't the kind of place where you air your family's dirty laundry. And honestly, I was ashamed. Marcus made me feel like I deserved it somehow. like I was asking for it by existing. Detective Chen leaned forward. Sophie, I want to be very clear about something. Nothing you did or didn't do justifies what your brother did to you. Physical abuse is never the victim's fault. Never. I felt tears starting to well up in my eyes. After so many years of being told I was the problem, hearing an adult say it wasn't my fault felt almost impossible to believe. Can you tell us about yesterday? Sarah asked. What led up to the incident on the stairs? I explained about being called to the principal's office, about Chloe's mom having reported her concerns to the school, about my parents, fury that I'd embarrassed the family. When I tried to run upstairs to my room, Marcus was right behind me. He said something like, running away again, just like always, and then his hands hit my back and I was falling. Did he say anything after you fell? He kept saying it was an accident, that he didn't push me that hard. But I saw his face when I was falling, Detective Chen. He looked surprised, like even he didn't expect it to be that bad. But not sorry. Never sorry. There was a commotion in the hallway, raised voices, someone demanding to see me. Through the door, I could hear my father's voice getting louder and angrier. That's our cue, Detective Chen said, standing up. Sophie, we're going to need you to give a formal statement, but we can do that when you're feeling stronger. Right now, I need to go speak with your parents and your brother. Marcus is here? He's in the waiting room with your parents and their lawyer, Sarah said. We called and asked him to come in this morning. My stomach dropped. He's going to be so angry. He can be angry all he wants, Detective Chen said firmly. He can't hurt you anymore. Hospital security has been notified, and we've put a temporary protection order in place. He's not allowed within 50 feet of you. After they left, I lay in the narrow hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, and listening to the chaos in the hallway. I could hear Marcus's voice, higher pitched than usual, insisting that it was all just a misunderstanding, and that I was exaggerating everything like always. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Dad's voice, loud enough to carry through the closed door. My son is not going to have his future destroyed by his sister's lies. Dr. Williams appeared in my doorway, looking grim. How are you holding up? Scared, I admitted. What's going to happen to me? Where am I going to live? She sat down beside my bed. Sarah Kim and I have been discussing that. The good news is that you're 16, so you have more say in your living situation than a younger child would. Do you have any relatives you trust? Anyone who might be willing to take you in? I thought about it. Most of my extended family lived across the country, and the ones who were local had always seemed to buy into my parents' version of events. But there was one person. My Aunt Rosa, I said slowly. My mom's sister. She lives about an hour away in Boulder. She's always been different from the rest of the family, more willing to ask uncomfortable questions. Do you think she'd be supportive? Maybe. She's the one who pulled me aside at Christmas and asked about the bruises on my arms. When I told her I'd fallen off my bike, she looked at me like she didn't quite believe it, but she didn't push. Would you like us to contact her? I nodded, feeling a tiny spark of hope. Aunt Rosa had always been the black sheep of the family, the one who'd chosen teaching over business, who'd never married, who asked pointed questions at family dinners that made everyone uncomfortable. Maybe that would work in my favor now. An hour later, Detective Chen returned with an update. We've arrested your brother on charges of assault and battery. The text message he sent you, combined with your medical evidence and testimony, gives us a strong case. What about my parents? That's more complicated. We can't prove they knew he was deliberately hurting you, but we can prove they failed to protect you from ongoing abuse. They'll likely face charges of child endangerment and neglect. My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Detective Chen looked at the screen and frowned. Don't answer that. Your parents hired a lawyer, and he's been trying to contact you directly. That's not appropriate while you're giving testimony. What does the lawyer want? Probably to convince you to change your story. To say it was all a misunderstanding, that you fell accidentally, that kind of thing. Sophie, I need you to know that you don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to. You have rights in this situation. That afternoon, Aunt Rosa arrived. I hadn't seen her in almost a year, but she looked exactly the same. Wild curly hair just starting to go gray, paint-stained jeans, and the kind of jewelry that jangled when she walked. She took one look at me lying in the hospital bed and started crying. "Oh, sweetie," she said, rushing to hug me carefully around all the medical equipment. I knew something was wrong. I should have trusted my instincts. "You couldn't have known," I said, but even as I said it, part of me wondered if she could have. If someone had just asked the right questions, pushed a little harder, maybe things would have been different. "Sarah Kim explained the situation to me," Aunt Rosa said, pulling a chair up beside my bed. "Sophie, I want you to know that if you want to come live with me, you're welcome. My house isn't fancy like your parents', and I don't have a lot of money, but you'll be safe." "What about Mom and Dad? Won't they try to stop you?" Aunt Rosa's expression hardened. "Let them try. I've been watching your mother make excuses for that boy for years, and I'm done staying quiet about it. You're my niece, and I love you. That's what matters." That evening, after Aunt Rosa had left to go home and pack a room for me, Detective Chen returned with more news. "We searched your house today with a warrant," she said. "We found some interesting things in Marcus's room." She pulled out her phone and showed me photos. These were hidden in his closet. I stared at the screen in horror. Photos of me. Some taken when I was sleeping, some when I was changing clothes, some showing bruises on my body that I'd tried to hide. He was watching me? It appears so. This suggests a pattern of stalking and harassment in addition to the physical abuse. It also explains how he always seemed to know when you were vulnerable. I felt sick. All those times I'd thought I was safe in my own room, he'd been watching, waiting, documenting my pain like some kind of trophy collection. "There's more," Detective Chen continued gently. "We found journals. His journals, where he wrote about hurting you, about planning ways to hurt you." The room seemed to spin around me. It was one thing to know that Marcus enjoyed hurting me, but to find out he'd been planning it, documenting it, treating it like a hobby. "I'm going to be sick," I whispered. Dr. Williams appeared with a basin just in time. As I reached into it, I could hear Detective Chen speaking quietly into her phone, adding new charges to Marcus's arrest warrant. When I'd finished being sick, Dr. Williams checked my vitals and gave me something for the nausea. "This is a lot to process," she said kindly. "It's normal to have a physical reaction to this kind of revelation. How could I have lived in the same house with him for 16 years and not known he was that sick?" "Because you were a child," Detective Chen said firmly. "Because he was careful to hide it from adults. Because your parents didn't want to see it. None of this is your fault, Sophie." That night, I lay awake staring at the hospital ceiling, my mind reeling with everything I'd learned. Marcus hadn't just been an abusive brother. He'd been a predator, systematically tormenting me while documenting every moment for his own twisted satisfaction. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than fear. I felt angry. Furiously, righteously angry. At what had been done to me. At the years of my life that had been stolen. At the way my parents had enabled it all. The anger felt good. It felt powerful. And tomorrow, when I gave my formal statement to Detective Chen, I was going to use that anger to make sure Marcus never had the chance to hurt anyone, ever again. The truth was out now, all of it. And there was no going back. The courtroom at the Jefferson County Justice Center felt like a cathedral of judgment. High ceilings, polished wood, and an atmosphere heavy with the weight of decisions that could change lives forever. I sat in the witness box 3 weeks after my hospital stay, my back still aching from the compression fracture but my voice stronger than it had ever been. Marcus sat at the defendant's table in a Navy suit that made him look younger than his 17 years, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. He'd been released on bail after spending 2 nights in juvenile detention, but the restraining order kept him from coming anywhere near me. Still, being in the same room with him made my skin crawl. "Sophie, can you tell the court what happened on the morning of March 15th? District Attorney Rebecca Martinez asked. The irony of sharing a last name with my family wasn't lost on anyone in the room. I looked out at the packed courtroom. Aunt Rosa sat in the front row, her paint-stained hands folded tightly in her lap. Behind her, I could see my parents with their team of lawyers, their faces masks of controlled fury. My mother hadn't looked at me once since I'd entered the courtroom. My parents called me to the principal's office because someone had reported concerns about bruises they'd seen on me. I began, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. When we got home, they were angry. They said I was embarrassing the family by telling lies about Marcus. What happened next? I tried to go to my room. I just wanted to get away from the arguing. But Marcus followed me to the stairs. I took a deep breath, remembering Detective Chen's advice about speaking slowly and clearly. He said something like running away again, just like always, and then he pushed me with both hands. Hard. Did you fall immediately? I flew, I said, the memory as vivid as if it were happening again. I remember thinking that I was going to die. I hit every step on the way down, and when I got to the bottom, I couldn't feel my legs. Marcus's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Thompson, stood up during his cross-examination with a patronizing smile. Sophie, you've admitted to having a contentious relationship with your brother. Isn't it possible that what you perceived as a push was actually Marcus trying to grab your arm to stop you from running away? No, I said firmly. He pushed me. With force. And it wasn't the first time he'd hurt me. But you have no witnesses to this alleged push, do you? The injuries speak for themselves, I replied, feeling that anger from the hospital room rising again. 11 separate fractures over 8 years don't happen by accident. Thompson shuffled through his papers. Dr. Williams testified about these old injuries, but isn't it true that you're an active teenager? You ride bikes, you swim, you participate in physical activities that could account for these injuries? I don't participate in sports, I said. I was too afraid of getting hurt at school because I was already getting hurt at home. Your Honor, Thompson said, I object to the witness's characterization. Overruled, Judge Patricia Harrison said crisply. The witness may describe her own experiences. The prosecution had done their homework. They'd interviewed my doctors, my teachers, even Chloe and her mother. They'd analyzed the photographs Marcus had hidden in his room, the journals where he'd written about teaching Sophie lessons and keeping her in line. Dr. Williams took the stand and walked the jury through each of my injuries with clinical precision. This pattern is not consistent with normal childhood accidents, she testified. These are injuries caused by deliberate force, spread out over years, affecting multiple body systems. When they showed the photographs Marcus had taken of me, sleeping, changing, crying, I saw several jury members wince. One woman actually covered her mouth with her hand. The most damning evidence came from Marcus's own journals, which the prosecution read aloud. Sophie was getting too comfortable again, talking to her friends about things that aren't their business. Had to remind her why keeping quiet is important. The basement storage room works well. Dark, soundproof, and she's terrified of spiders. She tried to tell Mom about the pool incident. Obviously had to make sure that wouldn't happen again. Note: holding breath underwater for extended periods can cause panic response that looks genuine to observers. Listening to those words read in court, hearing the calculated cruelty behind years of what I'd thought were impulsive moments of violence, I felt something break open inside my chest. This wasn't sibling rivalry or anger management issues. This was systematic torture, planned and executed by someone who enjoyed my suffering. Marcus took the stand in his own defense, and for a moment, I saw flashes of the golden boy who'd fooled everyone for so long. He spoke earnestly about loving his sister, about being concerned about her, quote, tendency towards self-harm and attention-seeking behavior. Sophie has always been dramatic, he said, looking directly at the jury. When she doesn't get her way, she makes up stories, she hurts herself and blames other people. I've been trying to protect her from herself for years. What about the photographs found in your room? D.A. Martinez asked during cross-examination. Marcus's composure slipped slightly. I was documenting her injuries because I was worried about her. I thought maybe if I showed our parents how often she was getting hurt, they'd get her help. And the journals? The detailed accounts of causing these injuries? Those are fiction, he said quickly. I write stories. Creative writing. Sophie's situation inspired some dark fiction, but that's all it was. Fiction, D.A. Martinez repeated slowly. So when you wrote, note to self, pressure points on ribs cause maximum pain with minimal visible damage, that was creative writing? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. I was exploring the psychology of sibling conflict. And when you wrote, Sophie tried to tell Aunt Rosa about the Christmas incident. Need to be more careful about timing and location, that was also fiction? Marcus looked at his lawyer desperately. I don't remember writing that. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a voice that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent courtroom. On the charge of assault and battery, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of stalking, we find the defendant guilty. On the charges of child abuse and endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. I felt Aunt Rosa's hand squeeze my shoulder as Marcus's face went white. My parents sat frozen in their seats, the reality of their son's conviction finally sinking in. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for the following week, but she addressed Marcus directly before court adjourned. Young man, you are 17 years old, which means you'll be tried as a juvenile for these crimes. However, the systematic nature of your abuse, the documentation of your planning, and the severe physical and psychological damage you've caused will all be factors in determining your sentence. After court, D.A. Martinez found me in the hallway. Sophie, I want you to know that you did the right thing. Testifying against family is never easy, but your courage is going to prevent him from hurting anyone else. What happens now? I asked. Now we wait for sentencing. Your brother will likely receive the maximum juvenile sentence. Detention until he turns 18, followed by supervised probation. He'll also be required to undergo psychological evaluation and treatment. And my parents? Their case is next month. The charges against them are less severe, but failure to protect a child from abuse is still a serious crime in Colorado. That night, I sat in Aunt Rosa's cozy Boulder house, surrounded by her paintings and pottery, and the kind of comfortable clutter that spoke of a life lived authentically. She made us tea and we sat on her couch, processing everything that had happened. Are you okay? She asked. I keep waiting to feel guilty, I admitted, like I should feel bad about sending my brother to detention, about destroying my family. Sophie, look at me. Aunt Rosa's voice was firm. You didn't destroy your family. Your family was already broken. You just stopped pretending it wasn't. But Marcus is going to hate me forever now. Marcus hated you long before this trial. The difference is, now everyone else knows it too. I curled up against the couch cushions, feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized. What if people at school think I'm a liar? What if they think I made it all up for attention? Then they're not people worth worrying about. The people who matter, the people who care about you, they know the truth now. My phone buzzed with a text from Chloe. Saw the news. I'm proud of you. You're the strongest person I know. More messages followed, from classmates I barely knew, from teachers, from family friends. Not all of them were supportive, but enough of them were that I started to believe maybe I could survive this after all. The local news had covered the trial, and while they'd used my initials instead of my full name, everyone at Riverside Academy knew exactly who SM was. Tomorrow, I'd have to face my classmates for the first time since the trial began. But tonight, I was safe in Aunt Rosa's house, with herbal tea and soft blankets, and the knowledge that I'd done something impossibly difficult and survived. I'd told the truth even when it hurt. I'd stood up to my abuser, even when it meant destroying the only family I'd ever known. And for the first time in 16 years, I could sleep without fear. Returning to Riverside Academy after the trial felt like walking into a fishbowl. Conversation stopped when I entered rooms. Students whispered behind their hands and stared with a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and something that looked like fear, as if family violence might be contagious. Just ignore them, Chloe said, linking her arm through mine as we walked toward first period English. Half of them are just glad it's not them in the spotlight. But ignoring the stares was easier said than done. My locker had been moved to a different section of the school. For security reasons, Principal Harrison had explained, and I had to take a different route to classes to avoid passing the spot where Marcus had cornered me that last morning. Marcus himself was gone, of course. After sentencing, he'd been transferred to a juvenile rehabilitation facility in Colorado Springs, where he'd remain until his 18th birthday. The judge had been clear. No contact with me, no unsupervised visits home, mandatory psychological counseling. My parents had received lighter sentences, community service, parenting classes, and supervised visitation rights with me until I turned 18. They'd also been ordered to pay for my medical expenses and therapy. The message was clear. They'd failed as parents, but the system still held out hope they could change. I wasn't so optimistic. "Sophie?" Mrs. Patterson called after English class. "Could you stay behind for a moment?" I waited while the other students filed out, some still shooting curious glances in my direction. Mrs. Patterson had been my favorite teacher before all this happened. She taught with passion and treated her students like thinking human beings rather than test scores. "How are you adjusting?" she asked when we were alone. "It's weird," I admitted. "Everyone either stares at me like I'm a zoo exhibit or goes out of their way to avoid me completely. That's normal, unfortunately. Most teenagers don't know how to process something like what you've been through." She sat on the edge of her desk, her expression thoughtful. "I wanted to talk to you about your writing." I blinked in surprise. "My writing?" "Your essays this semester have been different, more honest, more raw. There's a power in your voice now that wasn't there before." She pulled out a folder from her desk. "I'd like you to consider entering the state writing competition. The theme this year is finding your voice." I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of attention. "Sophie, you've already survived the hardest part. You told your truth in a courtroom full of people who wanted to discredit you, and you never wavered. A writing competition should be easy compared to that." She handed me a flyer for the competition. "Think about it. You have a story that could help other kids who are going through what you went through. Sometimes the best way to heal is to help others heal too." Living with Aunt Rosa was like learning to breathe again after years of holding my breath. Her house in Boulder was everything my parents' sterile mansion wasn't. Warm, lived in, filled with books and art supplies, and the smell of whatever experimental recipe she was trying in the kitchen. "How was school?" she asked when I got home that afternoon, looking up from a canvas where she was painting what looked like a storm cloud made of butterflies. "Weird. Mrs. Patterson wants me to enter a writing competition." "That sounds wonderful. What kind of writing?" I showed her the flyer, and she read it while absently wiping paint from her fingers. "Finding your voice. That's perfect for you." "I don't know. What if people read it and think I'm just looking for more attention?" Aunt Rosa set down her brush and turned to face me fully. "Sophie, honey, you spent 16 years having your voice silenced, dismissed, and ignored. Now you have the chance to use it to help other kids who might be in the same situation. Don't let fear make you silent again." That evening, I sat at the desk in my new bedroom, a cozy space under the eaves with slanted ceilings and windows that looked out over Rosa's garden, and tried to put words to everything I'd experienced. But every time I started writing about Marcus, about the abuse, about the trial, the words felt too small, too inadequate. Instead, I found myself writing about the moment I realized I wasn't crazy. The MRI machine sounded like the world ending, banging and clicking and whirring while I lay perfectly still and tried not to panic. I kept thinking about Dr. Williams' words, "Bones don't lie." For the first time in my life, someone was going to look for proof of what I'd been saying for years. When she showed me the images pointing out fractures and injuries I'd forgotten I'd even had, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Validation. The truth wasn't just in my memory anymore. It was written on my skeleton in white lines and shadow spots that no one could dismiss or explain away. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't attention-seeking. I wasn't making things up. I was a survivor. The words flowed easier after that. I wrote about the hospital, about Detective Chen and Sarah Kim. About the moment I realized that adults were finally listening to me. I wrote about the trial, about finding the courage to speak my truth even when my own family was arrayed against me. But mostly I wrote about hope, about the possibility of a life without fear, about learning to trust my own voice, about the incredible power of being believed. 2 weeks later, I submitted my essay to the state competition. I didn't tell anyone except Aunt Rosa, who celebrated by making my favorite chocolate chip cookies and letting me stay up late to watch old movies with her. My parents' trial was scheduled for the following month, and I was dreading it almost more than I dreaded Marcus's. At least with Marcus, the lines had been clear. He was my abuser, I was his victim. With my parents, everything felt more complicated. They failed to protect you. My therapist, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, reminded me during our weekly session, that's not complicated, that's neglect. Dr. Walsh was nothing like what I'd expected from a therapist. She was younger than my parents, with short red hair and a direct way of speaking that cut through my tendency to minimize or explain away what had happened to me. But they didn't know, I protested. Not really. They thought Marcus was just difficult. Sophie, your medical records show 11 separate injuries over 8 years. Your school counselor documented concerns about your behavior and appearance multiple times. Your aunt directly asked your mother about bruises she'd seen. At what point does not knowing become willful ignorance? I stared out the window of her office at the mountains in the distance. I keep thinking that if I'd been braver earlier, if I'd fought harder to make them believe me. Stop, Doctor. Walsh's voice was firm. You were a child. It was their job to protect you, not your job to make them do their job. But what if they really believed Marcus? What if they genuinely thought I was just clumsy and dramatic? Then they were negligent parents who chose to believe a comfortable lie rather than investigate an uncomfortable truth. Either way, Sophie, they failed you. The hardest part wasn't the anger. Anger felt clean and righteous and energizing. The hardest part was the grief. I was mourning the family I'd thought I had, the parents I desperately wanted them to be, the childhood that had been stolen from me piece by piece. It's okay to grieve, Dr. Walsh said. You're not just healing from abuse, you're healing from the loss of your entire family system. That's massive trauma, and it's going to take time. 3 weeks before my parents' trial, I got an unexpected visitor at Aunt Rosa's house. Chloe's mom, Mrs. Henderson, knocked on the door on a Saturday morning, holding a casserole dish and looking nervous. I hope you don't mind me stopping by, she said when Rosa invited her in. I wanted to talk to Sophie. We sat in Rosa's living room, surrounded by her paintings and the comfortable chaos of a house where creativity was valued over cleanliness. Mrs. Henderson set down her casserole dish and turned to me with tears in her eyes. Sophie, I owe you an apology. A huge one. I blinked in surprise. For what? For not pushing harder when Chloe told me about your bruises. For calling the school instead of calling the police directly. For assuming that a family like yours couldn't possibly. I made assumptions based on your parents' reputation, and I failed you. Mrs. Henderson, you're the reason I'm safe now. If you hadn't called the school, I should have done more sooner. She wiped her eyes with a tissue. I work in social services, Sophie. I see the signs of abuse every day in my job, and I still almost missed it in my own daughter's best friend. That's going to haunt me for a long time. You saved my life, I said quietly. Maybe you could have done it sooner, but you still did it. That matters. After Mrs. Henderson left, I sat in the garden with Aunt Rosa, helping her weed her vegetable patch, while we talked about forgiveness and second chances and the complicated ways that people fail each other. Do you think my parents will change? I asked. Rosa was quiet for a long time, her hands working methodically through the soil. I think your father is too proud to admit he was wrong about anything this significant. And your mother, she's spent so much energy protecting Marcus and the family image that I'm not sure she remembers how to protect her actual children. So no. I think they'll go through the motions. They'll take the classes and do the community service and say the right words. But real change? The kind that comes from genuinely understanding what they did wrong? She shook her head. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think they're capable of that kind of self-reflection. That night, I lay in my bed under the slanted ceiling, listening to the sounds of Rosa moving around downstairs, washing dishes, turning off lights, the gentle noises of someone caring for a home. For the first time since I was very small, I felt truly safe at night. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Jake, your cousin. I saw the news about the trial. I'm sorry I never said anything. I was scared, but that's no excuse. You're really brave." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Thank you. That means a lot." More messages started coming after that. From relatives I barely knew, from family friends, from people who had suspected something was wrong but hadn't known how to help. Not all of them were supportive, but enough of them were that I started to understand something important. I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. The truth had consequences, yes. My family was destroyed, my brother was in detention, my parents faced criminal charges. But the truth had also set me free, and for the first time in my life I was starting to believe that freedom might be worth the cost. The morning of my parents' trial, I woke up to find Aunt Rosa making pancakes in the shape of butterflies, something she'd started doing whenever she sensed I was having a particularly difficult day. The sweet smell of vanilla and cinnamon should have been comforting, but my stomach was too twisted with nerves to appreciate it. "You don't have to testify today if you're not ready," she said, not looking up from the griddle. "Sarah Kim said your written statement and the evidence from Marcus's trial would be enough." "I need to," I said, pushing the food around my plate. "If I don't speak for myself, who will?" The courthouse was less crowded this time. My parents' case hadn't generated the same media attention as Marcus's had. Child-on-child violence was sensational. Parental neglect was just another Tuesday in family court. But the weight of what was happening felt just as heavy. My parents sat at the defendant's table, looking like strangers. Mom had lost weight, her expensive clothes hanging loose on her frame. Dad's usually perfect hair was disheveled, and he kept checking his phone nervously. They'd hired a different lawyer this time. Their previous attorney had apparently decided that defending systematic child abuse wasn't good for his reputation. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Harrison, the same judge who'd sentenced Marcus. That felt like a small mercy. At least I wouldn't have to explain the whole story from the beginning again. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez approached the witness stand where I sat, her expression gentle but determined. "Sophie, I know this is difficult. Can you tell the court about your attempts to report your brother's abuse to your parents?" I looked out at the sparse courtroom. Aunt Rosa sat in the front row, as she had throughout Marcus's trial. Behind her, I spotted Mrs. Henderson, Chloe, and surprisingly, my cousin Jake, the boy who'd watched Marcus nearly drown me and said nothing. "I tried to tell them every time," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "After Marcus broke my wrist when I was 8, I told them he pushed me down the basement stairs on purpose. They said I was making up stories." "What was their response?" "Mom said I was trying to get Marcus in trouble because I was jealous of his achievements. Dad said I needed to be more careful and stop being so clumsy." And this pattern continued? For 8 years. Every injury, every incident I tried to tell them. The pool incident, where Marcus held me underwater until I nearly drowned, I told them he was trying to hurt me. They said I was being dramatic and that Marcus was just playing. I walked through years of dismissed reports, of being called a liar when I told the truth, of being punished for making up stories about my golden boy brother. With each example, I could see the jury's expressions growing more disturbed. "Sophie, in your opinion, did your parents know that Marcus was abusing you?" "My parents?" Lawyer objected, but Judge Harrison allowed the question. "I think they chose not to know," I said carefully. "I think it was easier to believe I was clumsy and dramatic than to admit their perfect son was hurting me." During cross-examination, my parents' attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Collins, tried to paint me as an unreliable narrator seeking revenge against a family that had tried their best with a difficult child. "Sophie, isn't it true that you were often in trouble at school for fighting with other students?" "No," I said firmly. "I was never in trouble for fighting. I avoided confrontation because I got enough of it at home." "But you were known to be accident-prone, weren't you? Your medical records show numerous emergency room visits." "Because I was being abused at home," I replied, "not because I was clumsy." Collins tried several more approaches, suggesting I was jealous of Marcus, implying I was making up stories for attention, even hinting that I might have been hurting myself. But drive? Williams had already testified about the impossibility of self-inflicted injuries in the locations and patterns found on my body, and Detective Chen had presented Marcus's own written confessions. The most damaging testimony came from my school counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had documented concerns about my behavior and appearance over several years. I noted multiple instances of Sophie coming to school with visible injuries. She testified. When I asked about them, she always had explanations. Fell off her bike, walked into a door, slipped in the bathroom. But the frequency was concerning. Did you report these concerns to her parents? Multiple times. I called home, sent letters, requested conferences. Mrs. Martinez always had explanations. Sophie was active, she was going through an awkward phase, she was seeking attention. When I suggested Sophie might benefit from counseling, Mrs. Martinez became defensive and suggested I was overstepping my bounds. Did you ever consider reporting to Child Protective Services? Mrs. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. I considered it several times, but the Martinez family had an excellent reputation in the community. Mr. Martinez was on the school board, Mrs. Martinez was active in the PTA. Marcus was a model student. I questioned my own judgment. The prosecution also called Dr. Sarah Kim, the CPS worker who'd been involved from the beginning. In my professional opinion, Dr. Kim testified, the Martinez parents demonstrated a pattern of willful blindness to their daughter's abuse. They consistently chose to believe explanations that protected their son, rather than investigating concerns that might have protected their daughter. Is this neglect? Absolutely. Parents have a legal and moral obligation to investigate credible reports of abuse. They have an obligation to protect their children, even when the threat comes from within the family. When my mother took the stand in her own defense, I barely recognized her. The polished, confident woman who'd run PTA meetings and charity events was gone, replaced by someone who looked fragile and lost. I never thought Marcus would really hurt Sophie, she said, her voice barely audible. They fought like all siblings do, and Sophie was always sensitive. She would cry over the smallest things. Mrs. Martinez, what about the multiple calls from Sophie's school expressing concern about her injuries? The school was overreacting, Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. Sophie played hard, she was active. Children get hurt. What about your sister Rosa's concerns? Mom's face crumpled slightly. Rosa never liked Marcus. She always thought I was too easy on him, too proud of him. I thought she was being jealous and trying to cause trouble. Even when she directly asked you about bruises on Sophie's body? Sophie bruises easily. She always has. I took her to doctors multiple times, and they never found anything wrong with her medically. The prosecutor pressed on. Mrs. Martinez, we have evidence that your son kept photographs of Sophie's injuries, that he wrote detailed accounts of causing those injuries. How do you explain missing signs that obvious? Mom broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know how I missed it. I don't know how I failed her so badly. My father was less emotional, but no more convincing. He testified about the pressures of running a successful business, about trusting his son, about believing that family matters should be handled within the family. I thought Sophie was going through a phase, he said. Teenagers can be dramatic. I thought she would grow out of it. Mr. Martinez, what about the 11 separate fractures documented over 8 years? Marcus was athletic, competitive. Sophie was smaller, less coordinated. I thought it was just normal sibling roughhousing that occasionally went too far. Even when Sophie told you directly that Marcus was hurting her? Dad shifted uncomfortably. Sophie has always been imaginative. She would exaggerate situations to get attention or to avoid taking responsibility for her actions. So when your daughter reported that her brother was abusing her, you didn't investigate? I talked to Marcus. He denied it. He was my son too. I had to consider his side of the story. Did you ever consider that your son might be lying? The pause stretched on so long that the judge prompted Dad to answer. No, he said finally. Marcus had never lied to me before. That you knew of, the prosecutor corrected. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, longer than they had for Marcus, but much shorter than I'd feared. When they returned, I could read nothing in their expressions. On the charges of child neglect and endangerment, how do you find? Guilty on all counts. My parents, faces crumpled simultaneously. Mom actually slumped forward, and Dad had to catch her arm to keep her upright. For a moment, I felt a stab of something that might have been sympathy. These were still my parents, still the people who'd raised me, still the family I'd once desperately wanted to love me properly. But then I remembered 8 years of dismissed concerns, of being called a liar when I told the truth, of being punished for being a victim. The sympathy faded. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for the following week, but she addressed my parents directly before adjourning court. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez, your failure to protect your daughter from systematic abuse represents one of the most troubling cases of neglect I've seen in my courtroom. You had multiple opportunities to investigate, to intervene, to protect your child. And at every turn, you chose to protect your son's reputation instead of your daughter's safety. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. I'd gotten better at ignoring them over the past few months, but one question stopped me in my tracks. Sophie, do you forgive your parents? I turned to face the camera, thinking about everything Dr. Walsh had taught me about healing and forgiveness, and the difference between the two. I'm working on forgiving them, I said finally. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen. It means I'm not going to let their failures define my future. What do you want to happen to them? I want them to get help. I want them to understand what they did wrong. And I want other parents to see what happens when you choose not to believe your child. A week later, my parents received their sentences: 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service with victim advocacy organizations, mandatory parenting and family counseling, and full restitution for my medical and therapy expenses. They also had to complete a program for parents of abuse survivors. It felt anticlimactic after everything we'd been through. 2 years of probation for 8 years of willful blindness. But Judge Harrison explained her reasoning during sentencing. Punishment alone won't heal this family, she said. Mrs. Martinez, Mr. Martinez, you have an opportunity here. Probably your last opportunity to understand your failures and work toward being the parents your daughter deserved from the beginning. I strongly encourage you to take it seriously. After the sentencing, my parents approached me in the courthouse hallway. It was the first time they'd tried to speak to me directly since the night I fell down the stairs. Sophie, Mom said, her voice hoarse from crying, we're so sorry. We know we failed you, and we want to make it right. How? I asked. It wasn't hostile, just genuinely curious. We'll do the counseling, the classes, whatever the court requires, Dad said. We want to understand how we got it so wrong. And then what? You want me to come home and pretend none of this happened? We want a chance to be better parents, Mom said. We want a relationship with you. I looked at these people who'd raised me, who'd fed and clothed and housed me, while completely failing to protect me from the person who was supposed to be my brother. I felt sad for them, and sorry for the family we might have been, but I didn't feel ready for reconciliation. Maybe someday, I said. But not today. Today, I need to focus on healing, and you need to focus on understanding why there's so much healing necessary. Aunt Rosa drove me home through the Colorado mountains, the late afternoon sun painting the peaks gold and purple. We didn't talk much during the drive. There would be time to process everything later, in Dr. Walsh's office, and in the safety of Rosa's kitchen, and in the quiet moments before sleep when the truth of what had happened finally felt real. Are you okay? Rosa asked as we pulled into her driveway. I think so, I said. It's over, isn't it? The legal stuff, I mean. It's finally over. The legal stuff is over, she agreed. Now comes the harder part. What's that? Figuring out who Sophie Martinez is when she's not fighting to survive. That night, I sat at my desk under the slanted ceiling and opened my laptop. I had an email waiting notification that I'd been selected as a finalist in the state writing competition. My essay about finding my voice would be published in an anthology of student writing, and I was invited to read it at the state capitol in front of legislators and educators. For the first time in months, I smiled a real smile. My voice. the one that had been silenced and dismissed and ignored for so long, was going to be heard. Not just in a courtroom or a therapy office, but in a place where it might actually help change things for other kids like me. I opened a new document and started writing. This time, not about the past, but about the future. About hope and healing and the incredible power of being believed. The legal battles were over. But my real story was just beginning. 6 months after my parents' sentencing, I stood at a podium in the Colorado State Capitol, looking out at an audience of legislators, educators, and advocates. My hands shook slightly as I held the printed copy of my essay, but my voice was steady when I began to read. My name is Sophie Martinez, and I am a survivor of family violence. For 8 years, I tried to tell adults that I was being hurt at home. For 8 years, I was told I was dramatic, clumsy, attention-seeking. For 8 years, I lived in a world where my truth was dismissed because it was inconvenient. The audience was completely silent. In the front row, I could see Aunt Rosa wiping tears from her eyes, and beside her, Dr. Walsh nodded encouragingly. "But bones don't lie," I continued, borrowing Dr. Williams' words. "And sometimes, when we finally find adults who are willing to listen, the truth can set us free." I read the entire essay, about the hospital, about finding my voice, about learning that being believed was the first step toward healing. When I finished, the applause was thunderous, but what mattered more were the people who approached me afterward. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a gentle smile introduced herself as Maria Santos, the paramedic who'd been the first person to really listen to me that day at my parents' house. "I've been following your story," she said. "What you've done, speaking up like this, it's going to help so many kids." "I hope so," I said. "That's kind of the point." "It is. Trust me, I see a lot of situations like yours in my job. Most kids never find their voice the way you have. Most families never face consequences. You're making a difference." A teenage boy about my age waited nervously until the crowd thinned before approaching me. He was tall and lanky, with dark hair that fell across his eyes. "Hi," he said quietly. "I'm David. I heard you speak and I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For saying what I've never been able to say. About my dad. About how adults don't always listen when it's family doing the hurting." My heart clenched. "Are you safe now?" "I'm working on it. Your story gave me courage to talk to my school counselor. We're starting the process." I gave him my email address and the number for the crisis hotline Dr. Walsh had taught me about. "You don't have to do this alone," I told him. "There are people who will believe you." The drive back to Boulder with Aunt Rosa was quiet but comfortable. We'd fallen into an easy routine over the past months. She'd ask me how I was feeling, I'd give her an honest answer, and we'd talk through whatever came up without judgment or pressure to be fine. "I'm proud of you," she said as we wound through the mountain roads. "Not just for today, but for everything. The way you've handled all of this, the way you're using your experience to help others, your parents should be proud too. Are they? Proud, I mean?" Rosa was quiet for a moment. "I think they're trying to understand what that even means now. Your mom calls me sometimes, you know. She asks how you're doing, if you're happy. What do you tell her?" "The truth. That you're healing, that you're strong, that you're becoming the person you were always meant to be." My relationship with my parents had evolved into something complicated and careful. They'd completed their court-mandated counseling and community service, and they sent me letters through Rosa, not asking to see me, but updating me on their progress and expressing what seemed like genuine remorse. Mom's letters were full of apologies and self-recrimination. She wrote about the therapy she was doing, about learning to recognize the signs she'd missed, about understanding how her need to maintain the family's perfect image had blinded her to her daughter's pain. Dad's letters were more analytical, detailing the parenting classes he'd taken and the books he'd read about family violence. He wrote about his own childhood, about how his father had dismissed emotions as weakness, and how he'd passed that dysfunction down to his own children. I read every letter, but I hadn't responded to any of them. I wasn't ready for that step yet, and Dr. Walsh assured me that was perfectly normal. "Healing isn't linear," she reminded me during our weekly sessions, "and forgiveness isn't required for your own recovery. You get to decide when and if you want to rebuild those relationships. Sometimes I miss them, I admitted. Not the way they were, but the way I wanted them to be. The parents I needed them to be. That's grief, Dr. Walsh said gently. You're mourning the family you deserve to have. That's a necessary part of this process. School had become easier as the months passed. The initial stares and whispers had died down, replaced by something that felt more like respect. I'd started a support group for students dealing with family issues, and we met every Thursday in Mrs. Patterson's classroom. The hardest part isn't the abuse itself, said Emma, a junior whose stepfather had been hitting her for 2 years. It's feeling like no one will believe you if you tell. The hardest part is loving them anyway, added Michael, whose mother struggled with addiction and left him to care for his younger siblings. How do you hate someone who's supposed to love you? These conversations were painful but necessary. We were all learning that trauma didn't follow a neat timeline, that healing was messy and nonlinear, and that having people who understood made all the difference. Chloe had become my closest friend through all of this, but our relationship had deepened in ways I hadn't expected. She'd started volunteering with a local domestic violence organization, saying that watching what I'd been through had opened her eyes to how often these things were happening right under everyone's noses. I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, she said one day as we sat in Aunt Rosa's garden, helping her plant tomatoes. How many times you canceled plans at the last minute, how you always seemed nervous about going home, how you never wanted anyone to come over to your house. You were a kid too, I reminded her. It wasn't your job to recognize abuse, but I was your best friend. I should have known something was wrong. You did know. You're the one who told your mom about the bruises. You're the reason the school got involved. Chloe, you literally saved my life. She wiped her eyes with the back of her gardening glove. I just hate that you went through all of that alone. I'm not alone now, I said simply. Marcus had been in juvenile detention for 8 months now. I received updates through the victim advocacy program. He was doing well in his classes, participating in mandatory counseling, and would be eligible for supervised release in a few more months when he turned 18. The thought of him being free again terrified me, even though the restraining order would remain in effect. Dr. Walsh and I had spent many sessions talking about my fears and developing safety plans for when that day came. He's going to hate me even more now, I said during one particularly difficult session. Maybe, Dr. Walsh agreed, but he's also going to be under intense scrutiny. Probation officers, mandatory check-ins, required therapy. And you're not the same scared 16-year-old you were when this started. You're stronger now. You have a support system. You have a voice. What if he tries to hurt me again? Then we call the police immediately, and he goes back to detention. Probably as an adult this time. Sophie, you're not helpless anymore. You know the signs, you know your rights, and you have people who will believe you. The writing competition had led to other opportunities. I'd been invited to speak at conferences about child abuse prevention, and a publisher had expressed interest in me writing a book about my experiences. The idea was both terrifying and exciting. I don't know if I'm ready to put all of this in a book, I told Mrs. Patterson during one of our regular check-ins. You don't have to be ready today, she said, but think about the kid you were a year ago. Terrified, voiceless, convinced no one would believe you. If that Sophie had found a book by someone who'd been through what you've been through, wouldn't it have helped? It would have saved my life, I admitted. Then you have your answer. Spring in Boulder was beautiful. The mountains still capped with snow, while the valley bloomed with wildflowers and new growth. I'd started taking long walks in the mornings before school, something that would have been impossible when I lived with my parents. I'd been too afraid to leave the house early, too afraid of what Marcus might do if he caught me alone. Now I walked for miles, listening to podcasts about trauma recovery and survivor stories, breathing in the thin mountain air and feeling my body grow stronger with each step. Physical therapy for my back injury had turned into a general fitness routine, and I was amazed by what my body could do when it wasn't constantly recovering from violence. You look different, Aunt Rosa observed one morning as I came back from a particularly long hike. Taller, somehow. I feel different, I said. Like I'm finally living in my own body instead of just existing in it. That's what healing looks like, she said with a smile. That afternoon, I sat down at my laptop and opened a new document. For months, I'd been thinking about Mrs. Patterson's challenge, about the book I might write, about the girl I used to be who desperately needed someone to tell her she wasn't crazy. I started with a single line. They say I slipped on the wet bathroom tiles. The words flowed easier than they ever had before. Not just the facts of what had happened, but the emotions, the fear, the slow journey from victim to survivor. I wrote about finding my voice, about learning to trust adults again, about the complicated process of grieving a family that was never what I needed it to be. I wrote about hope. 3 hours later, I had the outline for a book and the first chapter written. I called Mrs. Patterson and read it to her over the phone. "Sophie," she said when I finished, "this is going to change lives, including yours." That night, I lay in my bed under the slanted ceiling, listening to the sounds of Aunt Rosa moving around downstairs. For the first time since I was very small, the sounds of another person in the house at night were comforting rather than terrifying. My phone buzzed with a text from David, the boy I'd met at the Capitol. "Wanted you to know, I talked to CPS today. They're taking my case seriously. Thank you for showing me it was possible." I smiled and typed back, "You're braver than you know. Keep fighting for yourself. You deserve to be safe." Outside my window, the mountains stood silent and strong against the starry sky. I was 17 years old. I was a survivor of family violence, and I was finally, truly free. Tomorrow, I would continue writing my book. Tomorrow, I would go to school and lead my support group and be a normal teenager, dealing with normal teenage problems. Tomorrow, I would continue the long, necessary work of healing. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be alive, to be safe, and to have found my voice in a world that had tried so hard to silence it. The scared, voiceless girl who had fallen down those stairs 8 months ago was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth, someone who understood that surviving was just the first step. Now came the best part: learning how to truly live. 1 year after I first stood in that hospital room and learned that bones don't lie, I stood in another room entirely, the offices of Rocky Mountain Youth Advocacy, where I'd just finished my first day as a peer counselor intern. At 17, I was younger than most of their volunteers, but my story had opened doors that might have otherwise remained closed. "How did it go?" asked Jennifer Walsh, who had transitioned from being my therapist to being my supervisor in this new role. The relationship shift felt natural. We'd moved from doctor-patient to mentor-mentee as my healing progressed. "Terrifying and amazing," I said honestly, sinking into the familiar chair across from her desk. "I talked to 3 kids today. One of them reminded me so much of myself a year ago. That look in her eyes, like she's waiting for adults to stop believing her. And I told her that I believed her, that she wasn't crazy or dramatic or attention-seeking. I showed her the scar from my spinal surgery and told her that sometimes the proof of what happened to us is written on our bodies, but even when it's not, our experiences are still valid." Dr. Walsh smiled. "That's exactly what she needed to hear." "What did you need to hear when you were in her position?" "That it wasn't my fault, that I deserved to be safe, that someone, somewhere, would believe me if I just kept trying to tell the truth." I paused, thinking about the girl I'd counseled that morning. Emma, 14 years old, with bruises on her arms and a story about a stepfather who'd convinced her mother she was difficult and accident-prone. "Dr. Walsh, what if I can't help them enough? What if they go back to dangerous situations because I said the wrong thing?" "Sophie, do you remember what you told me once about healing not being linear? That it's messy and complicated, and sometimes you take steps backward?" "Exactly. Your job isn't to save these kids. It's to plant seeds. To show them that survival is possible, that healing is possible, that they have value and worth, regardless of what their families have told them. The rest is up to them and the adults in their lives who are trained to help them navigate the system." The system. A year ago, That word would have filled me with dread. Social workers and police officers and lawyers who might not believe me, might not understand, might make everything worse. Now I understood that the system, while imperfect, was also full of people like Dr. Walsh and Detective Chen and Maria Santos, people who dedicated their lives to protecting kids like me. My book had been published 3 months earlier. Bones Don't Lie. A survivor's journey to finding her voice was doing better than anyone had expected, not just commercially, but in terms of impact. I received emails daily from teenagers who'd recognized themselves in my story, from parents who'd realized they needed to listen more carefully to their children, from educators who were implementing new protocols for recognizing abuse. The hardest email to receive had come from my mother, Sophie Salter. I read your book last week. I know I don't have the right to reach out to you directly, but I needed you to know that I understand now, really understand what we put you through. Reading your words, seeing our family through your eyes, understanding the depth of pain we caused, there are no adequate apologies for what we did to you. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness, though I hope someday you might find it in your heart to consider it. I'm writing to tell you how proud I am of the woman you're becoming. Your strength, your courage, your commitment to helping other children who are suffering the way you suffered. It's more than we deserved from you. Your father and I have started a foundation in your honor. We're funding programs for parent education and abuse prevention. It's a small way of trying to make amends for our failures, and we hope it helps other families avoid the mistakes we made. I love you, Sophie. I always have, even when I failed to show it, even when I failed to protect you. You deserved so much better from us, Mom. I'd read that letter a dozen times, crying through most of them. It was everything I'd wanted to hear from her for years, and yet it felt too little, too late. The foundation was a good thing. I'd researched it and found it was legitimate, already funding several worthwhile programs. But it didn't erase 8 years of dismissed concerns and willful blindness. Are you going to respond to her? Aunt Rosa had asked when I showed her the letter. I don't know, I'd admitted. Part of me wants to. But part of me is afraid that if I let them back into my life, I'll become that scared little girl again. Sophie, honey, you could never become that scared little girl again. She doesn't exist anymore. You've grown too much, learned too much about your own worth. You get to decide what relationship, if any, you want with your parents. But don't make that decision out of fear. I still hadn't responded to Mom's letter, but I'd started writing responses in my journal. Letters I might never send, but that helped me process my complicated feelings about forgiveness and family and the possibility of redemption. Marcus had been released from juvenile detention 2 months earlier, on his 18th birthday. The restraining order was still in effect, and he'd been ordered to complete additional counseling and community service as part of his probation. I'd seen him once, from a distance at the courthouse when he'd had to check in with his probation officer. He looked different, older, thinner, with something in his posture that suggested he carried his own weight of consequences now. He hadn't tried to contact me, which was both a relief and somehow disappointing. Part of me, the part that still remembered loving my big brother before I learned to fear him, had hoped he might try to apologize, to make amends somehow. But maybe some relationships were too broken to repair. How's the college planning going? Dr. Walsh asked, bringing me back to the present. Good. Scary, but good. I'd been accepted to several schools, including University of Colorado Boulder, where I planned to study social work with a focus on trauma counseling. It feels strange, making plans for the future. For so long I couldn't imagine living past 18. And now? Now I have so much I want to do. Kids to help, stories to tell, maybe a doctorate someday so I can do research on family violence prevention. I paused. Is it weird that I'm grateful for what happened to me? Not weird at all. Trauma can be transformative when we're able to process it with proper support. You're taking something terrible that happened to you and using it to help others. That's the definition of post-traumatic growth. After our session, I drove to Riverside Academy to pick up Chloe. She'd decided to attend CU Boulder too, and we were planning to be roommates, something that would have been impossible when I lived with my parents, when I was too afraid to let friends get too close to my truth. The school looked the same as it had 2 years ago, but I felt like a completely different person walking through those hallways. Students still stared sometimes, I'd become something of a local celebrity after my book came out. But the stares felt different now. Less like curiosity about a scandal, and more like respect for someone who'd survived something difficult. "Sophie!" Mrs. Patterson waved me over to her classroom. "Perfect timing. I wanted to show you something." She handed me a stack of essays, entries for this year's state writing competition, which she was helping to coordinate. "Look at the themes these kids are choosing. Finding my voice, breaking the silence, truth and consequences. You've inspired a whole generation of students to write about difficult truths." I flipped through the essays, reading titles and opening lines that spoke to experiences of bullying, family dysfunction, mental health struggles, identity crises. These kids were choosing to be vulnerable on paper, to share their authentic selves, rather than hiding behind perfect facades. "This is incredible," I said. "They're so brave." "They learned from watching you be brave," Mrs. Patterson replied. "That's leadership, Sophie, real leadership." Chloe found me in the hallway a few minutes later, practically bouncing with excitement. "Guess what? Emma, the girl from your support group, just got accepted to her first choice college with a full scholarship. She wants to study law now, says she's going to specialize in family court advocacy." Emma, the junior whose stepfather had been abusing her. She'd found the courage to report him after attending our support group for several months, and while the legal process had been painful, she'd ended up in a much safer living situation with her grandmother. "That's amazing," I said, feeling that familiar warmth that came from knowing someone else had found their way out of darkness. "She said to tell you that your book changed her life, that seeing someone who'd been through something similar and came out the other side gave her hope that she could do it too." We drove home through the familiar streets of our suburban Denver neighborhood, past my parents' house, which I still thought of as my parents' house rather than home. I'd driven by it once, about 6 months earlier, and had been surprised to see a for sale sign in the yard. Aunt Rosa had explained later that my parents had decided they needed a fresh start, somewhere without so many painful memories. They'd bought a smaller house in a different suburb and were both working with the foundation they'd started, trying to turn their failures into something that might help other families. "Do you ever miss it?" Chloe asked as we passed the turnoff to their old street. "I miss what I wanted it to be," I said. "I miss the idea of having parents who loved me unconditionally and a brother who protected me instead of hurting me, but I don't miss being afraid all the time." "Are you afraid now, ever?" I considered the question. "Sometimes. I'm afraid of Marcus showing up somewhere unexpected, of my parents trying to guilt me into a relationship I'm not ready for, of people thinking I'm making up my story for attention. But it's different now. It's normal fear about specific things, not this constant terror that colored everything I did." "What's the best part about not being afraid?" "Sleeping through the night, making plans for the future, being able to trust people, having opinions and expressing them without worrying about consequences." I pulled into Rosa's driveway, where my aunt was working in her garden, her hands covered in soil and her face peaceful in the late afternoon sun. Having a family that actually feels like family. That evening, Rosa and I cooked dinner together, something that had become one of my favorite rituals. She taught me to make her grandmother's enchiladas while I helped her plan her next art exhibition, a series of paintings about resilience and growth. "I got an email from the publisher today," I said as we worked. "They want me to write a second book, this one about the healing process, about what life looks like after surviving trauma. Are you interested?" "Very. But I want to wait until I've been in college for a while, until I have more perspective on this whole process. I don't want to write about healing while I'm still in the thick of learning how to do it." "That's wise. What would you call it?" I thought about it while I grated cheese. Maybe something like "After the Fall," about picking yourself up and discovering who you are when you're not just surviving. I love that. You know, Sophie, watching you these past 2 years has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. Seeing you transform from that scared, broken girl into this confident young woman who's dedicated her life to helping others. "I'm not completely healed," I interrupted. "I still have bad days. I still wake up from nightmares sometimes. I still struggle with trusting people completely." "I know, but that's not what I'm talking about." I'm talking about your spirit, the core of who you are. That was never broken, even when everything else was. It just got buried under years of abuse and neglect. Now it's free. After dinner, I sat at my desk under the slanted ceiling and opened my laptop to write in my daily journal, a practice Dr. Walsh had encouraged and that had become as essential as breathing. Today was a good day, I wrote. I helped 3 kids at the advocacy center. I saw how my story is inspiring other young people to find their voices, and I had dinner with Rosa while we planned our futures. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined feeling this hopeful about anything. I think about Marcus sometimes, and my parents, and wonder if they're healing too. I hope they are. I hope Marcus is learning to understand what he did wrong and how to be better. I hope my parents are becoming the kind of people who would believe a child who came to them asking for help. But mostly, I think about tomorrow, about college in the fall, about the kids I'll help, about the stories I'll write, about the life I get to build now that I'm free to build it. Dr. Walsh says recovery isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about integrating those experiences into a life that has meaning and purpose. I think I'm finally understanding what she means. I'm not just a survivor anymore. I'm someone who survived and chose to use that survival to help others. I'm someone who fell down and got back up and decided to make sure other people knew they could get back up too. The scared little girl who hid in bathroom stalls and made excuses for bruises is still part of me, but she's not all of me. She's just one chapter in a story that's still being written. My phone buzzed with a text from David, the boy I'd met at the Capitol a year earlier. 1-year update. Living with my aunt now. Starting therapy. Feeling hopeful for the first time in years. Thank you for showing me it was possible. I smiled and texted back. Thank you for being brave enough to save yourself. Keep going. It gets so much better. Another message came in, this one from a stranger. I read your book and recognized my own story. I'm finally ready to tell someone about what's happening at home. Thank you for your courage. These messages came daily now. From teenagers finding the strength to speak up, from parents learning to listen better, from survivors decades older than me, who said my story had helped them process their own childhood trauma. Each one reminded me why the pain of the past 2 years had been worth it. Before bed, I stood at my bedroom window and looked out at the mountains, dark silhouettes against the starry sky. Somewhere out there, kids were lying in bed, afraid to sleep, afraid of what tomorrow might bring, convinced that no adult would believe them if they told the truth about what was happening in their families. But some of those kids had read my book, or heard my speeches, or found their way to support groups or advocacy centers, where people like me were waiting to tell them they weren't alone. Some of them would find their voices a little sooner, would get help a little faster, would discover their own strength a little earlier than they might have otherwise. That knowledge filled me with something I'd never experienced as a child, a sense of purpose that transcended my own survival. I was Sophie Martinez. I was 18 years old. I was a survivor of family violence, a published author, a peer counselor, and a college-bound social work student. I was also living proof that falling down doesn't have to mean staying down, and tomorrow I would continue helping other people learn to fly.